Hello, I'm delighted to be with you for this first edition of Leap Fast, Transforming Higher Education, Reshaping Societies for Sustainability in the Face of Multiple Crises, Conflicts, and Inequalities. And I'm going to be exploring with you the question of how we apply critical approaches to thinking about transforming higher education. My name is Penny Jane Burke. I am UNESCO Chair in Equity, Social Justice, and Higher Education, and the Director of the Center of Excellence for Equity in Higher Education. And my field is sociology. My field of work is around gender and its intersections with other inequalities and how these are produced in and through and beyond higher education, but also thinking about when we apply critical approaches and draw from the wealth of insights from critical literatures, and we translate that for action in a praxis-based framework, which is really bringing a dialogue across theory and practice, then we can make higher education transformational. We can realize the transformational potential of higher education, not just for individual lives, but for social purposes as well. And when I use the word purpose, I want to encourage you to think from a critical perspective about what is the purpose of higher education. If we're engaged in a process of transformation, what are we trying to transform? And why are we trying to do that? What are the underpinning values and perspectives and intentions that we're bringing to that work? This leads me to say that we must understand that transformation itself is contested over. So when we use the word transformation, we might be thinking that we share, what that means. But actually, there are many different kinds of ways of thinking about what transformation means. And not all of these forms of transformation align with the Sustainable Development Goals. So, for example, there's been from the critical literature a lot of critique around how higher education has been transformed by corporate, neoliberal, marketized, commercialized intentions. And that is a form of transformation. So we can talk about it as transformation. But I would argue that those values and politics do not align with helping us to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So this raises a dilemma for us. How do we work within dominant frameworks and contest some of those more those kinds of ideas around transformation that are not aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals? And I think that this leads us back to really articulating the fundamental purpose of higher education, which is education. It's not business. It's not commercialization. It is about education and it's about knowledge production. So a critical approach when we start to unpack some of these things enables us to understand that to progress the SDGs, we need to both reflect and act on the entrenched inequalities within and beyond higher education, because inequalities are everywhere. They're not just in a certain person or individual. They are entrenched in the very ways we think about transformation, because who gets to decide, who participates in deciding what is important, whose values are brought to the framework, whose knowledges are brought to the framework, and thinking about the goals of transformation. And there's a whole range of different inequalities that we need to apprehend when we think about these questions. So, for example, in what ways is colonialism entrenched in higher education? And what do we do to decolonize higher education, for example? So there are a whole range of different important critical questions that we can start to apply to think about transformation in a more critical way, to uncover and unpack some of the taken for granted assumptions and values that are at play that reproduce the very things that we're trying to transform. For example, inequalities. in and through and beyond higher education. I say in higher education when I mean what happens within higher education. But of course, higher education is a very powerful institution. So we have to think that it's preparing students and staff as well as leaders, as future leaders, as change agents, and as professionals who are holding particular bodies of knowledge and perhaps excluding others. So we need to think very carefully about higher education's relationship outside of higher education to what it's projecting in terms of its institutional power to legitimate knowledge and what counts as knowledge and who counts as being a knowledge holder. And the SDGs are diverse. We've got 17 SDGs, and they focus around different kinds of areas of disciplinary expertise. But one of the issues is that we need, in order to meet and address all 17 SDGs, what are the structures in higher education that block us from working across those disciplinary areas and that expertise so that we can have a broader framework for understanding the SDGs across all of the range of intentions and imperatives that the SDGs raise for us. And this requires interdisciplinary knowledge to be woven together to address the interrelation across and between the 17 SDGs. Now, I am very concerned with the social dimensions of the SDGs, and in particular, for example, access to quality education, reducing inequalities, building gender equality, and generating more peaceful and democratic societies. So those social dimensions have huge relationship to the more environmentally oriented of the SDGs. And if we take indigenous knowledges, for example, indigenous knowledges helps us to think about the relationship of human beings to all beings and to country and to the world. So, it really is important that we think about what forms of knowledge are we engaging when we're engaging with the 17 SDGs. And it's really important, as I said earlier, to understand that higher education has the potential to reproduce inequalities because it's not just about fitting people into higher education so that they can gain a qualification. It's about the power of higher education to legitimize particular forms of knowledge and particular forms of being in the world. And so we need to think about that in terms of the reproduction of wider sociocultural inequalities and make sure that we're mindful of those challenges and complexities. But as I said earlier, higher education also has the power to transform inequalities, particularly when we bring a critical set of insights, rich and important insights into the frame as tools for us to think with and then for us to act with differently. We also need to think about the systemic structural layers of transformation, taking a socio-cultural political approach to transformation for the reasons that I have said. So when we focus only on individual levels and we think only about transforming behavior or attitudes of individuals, we don't have the capacity then to make broader transformations for the SDGs that would require us to also pay close attention to the systemic, structural, social, cultural, and political levels of transformation that we also need to engage. And in thinking about this, we also need a whole of institution approach. And when I say whole of institution, I mean our own institutions, but also thinking about the global institution of higher education and what kinds of values are circulating to drive forward transformation, sometimes in ways that divert attention away from the SDGs. So I'm going to now move on to think about some practical ways forward. I mean, first of all, in thinking about the system level, we need to strongly articulate and advocate the need for ensuring funding to support higher education to undertake this transformative work, because it can't be kind of ad hoc, fragmented work. It must be genuinely in-depth, sustained work for sustainability. So, we need to think about the sustainability of higher education itself in the project of transformation. We also need to advocate within higher education institutions for creating structures for the allocation of resources to support and sustain this work. And we need to avoid models where there's a single person or unit doing this work, because this again fragments, it sort of places the burden on the shoulders of a few individuals or even one individual without embedding that into the whole of the institution. And we need to also avoid a focus on a singular understanding of sustainability. So, for example, taking one aspect of the 17 SDGs and focusing only on that. So, for example, we might focus on environmental concerns and forget about the importance of focusing also on the social dimensions. So we must keep these in constant dialogue with each other through the power of interdisciplinary work. So, we really need to work in deeply collaborative ways. And structurally, this is sometimes difficult because higher education is often structured in ways that is about individual units of income generation rather than developing a collaborative culture of change making for the SDGs. So this is the transformative power of Leap Fast and thinking through these issues and bringing them back to our institutions and to government ministers and to broader influencers in reshaping higher education for our collective well-being and futures. We need to find ways to embed the SDGs in the curriculum in the same way across the whole institution so that students who are future change agents are able to engage with the SDGs in the ways that I've been talking about. And this requires that we have a very deep, in-depth understanding of what inclusivity looks like, a commitment to challenging inequalities and not expecting people to just conform to the status quo, which is a form of symbolic violence and exclusion, something that I'll talk about a little bit more in our week together in Saudi Arabia at Majma University. And to support this, and this is what's so important about Leap Fast, we need quality professional learning as a whole of institution approach to cultural change. So, it's not enough to say this is what we need to do. We need to provide the resources and the means to do that and engage people in that process as full participants who understand what the reasons are, what the purpose is, that there's a strong articulation of that to bring people together to make the change that's required. And in my own work, I talk about communities of praxis rather than communities of practice. We all have communities of practice, which are incredibly important to our sense of shared identity as professionals, as educators, as academics, as faculty members, and so on. And that's very important because those are the spaces in which we work collaboratively to drive forward change. But I've inserted the idea of praxis rather than practice as a way to engage with that critical process, dialogic process of bringing theory into play with action and bringing action into play with theory so that this is an ongoing process where we're learning together. We're learning with new knowledges and also knowledges that have been historically excluded, such as First Nations knowledges that have so much to bring of value to this process of transforming higher education. So thank you so much for listening, and I really hope that this is a fantastic journey and collaborative journey for you, and I look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you very much.